Have you ever spent entire nights fighting your own thoughts and with your eyes open even when everything around you was dark? Ever felt like the early morning was the time when ghosts spoke most? For years, I couldn't close my eyes without reliving it all. Every gunshot, every scream, every scene that should have been in the past. It came back with a vengeance, as if the war had never ended. They weren't just memories. It was a battlefield inside my mind. And the worst part? No one saw them. The scars were there but invisible. The truth is, many people think soldiers return home and that's it. Mission accomplished, end of story. But anyone who's lived through the hell of war knows, returning doesn't mean returning. My body was here, but my soul was still hiding in trenches of fear, pain, and silence. I smiled at Sunday lunch, but inside, I was in pieces. Have you ever felt that way? Like you were present, yet absent at the same time? I didn't believe in miracles. In fact, the word miracle seemed distant, fanciful, like a consolation for those who had nothing left to cling to, until the day I managed to sleep peacefully. Sounds simple, right? Sleep. But for those carrying invisible traumas, sleeping is like facing the battlefield again. And that night, when I finally felt the weight of my eyelids win without fear, without guilt, without pain, I understood that a miracle isn't always a bolt from the blue. Sometimes, it's just silence. It's the peace you thought you'd never know again. This story isn't just about me. It's about thousands of soldiers, fathers, mothers, children, ordinary people who returned from war different, who carry with them the pain no one sees, who remain silent out of shame, out of fear of not being understood, and who often lose the battles within their homes, within themselves. That's why what you're about to discover now may surprise you, and perhaps even touch a place deep inside you've forgotten. Stay with me until the end, because what began as pain can transform into something you never imagined. There are paths, there are voices, there are outstretched hands, even when everything seems to be falling apart. And perhaps, by hearing this story, you'll see your own. Or perhaps you'll remember someone who desperately needs to hear it today. You'll understand that the miracle isn't erasing the past. It's learning to live with it, and still be able to sleep peacefully. But before that, let me take you back to the beginning, to life before the war, to the moment when everything seemed normal. Because to understand the transformation, you need to feel the contrast, and that's where it begins. Because to understand the transformation, you need to feel the contrast, and that's where it begins. Before the war, I thought I knew what fear was. Fear of making a mistake, of disappointing someone, of not being good enough. But nothing compares to the fear that lives inside those who survived. Nothing prepares you for the feeling of returning home and not recognizing yourself in the mirror, of seeing your child running in the yard, while your mind is still trapped behind destroyed walls, hearing the sound of sirens and gunshots. It's like living in two worlds at once, and for a long time, I thought I was alone in this. Maybe you know someone who also came back different, or maybe you yourself are facing a war no one sees. And if any part of this story touched something deep inside you, if any phrase resonated as if it were about you, then comment below. Tell me, what has touched you most so far? Sometimes just putting our feelings into words is the first step toward healing what's been hurt, and your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read to keep them going. If this conversation resonated with you, if it ever gave you a lump in your throat or sparked a glimmer of hope, then please leave a like. This shows that it's worth continuing to share stories like this. Real, human, imperfect, but full of truth. This is how we build a safe space here. A space where pain isn't silenced but transformed into bridges. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Not only to keep up with what's coming next, but to be part of a community that believes even the deepest scars can tell stories of overcoming. Every subscription, every like, every comment is what keeps this message alive and able to reach more and more people who need to hear that they are not alone. Your presence here makes all the difference. And now that you're with me, let me show you how it all began. Because life before the war may seem simple, but it was exactly there that the silent pain began to form. Before the war, everything seemed simple. Waking up early, having breakfast with his wife, taking his son to school, commuting to work, listening to music in the car. There were days when traffic was chaos, and he complained. There were months when money was tight, and he calculated everything. But even so, there was a certain peace in knowing what to expect tomorrow. There was a sense that even with the challenges, life followed a predictable course. He was like any of us, Until the day everything changed. It wasn't an easy decision. No one enlists expecting to return a different person, but there was a sense of duty, of purpose, of something greater than himself, a calling that seemed meaningful at the time. And the truth is, deep down, perhaps he also wanted to prove something, to himself, to the world, or perhaps to silence an uneasiness that existed even before the war began. The farewell was quick, a tight hug to his son, a tentative smile to disguise the fear in his wife's eyes, and a heavy silence on the ride to the airport. He pretended he was prepared, but no one is, not even the most trained, because it's not combat that destroys first, it's the small voids that begin to open up inside, the spaces where once there was routine, now filled with uncertainty and unanswered questions. And so, ordinary life was left behind. His favorite coffee cup in the cupboard, his toys scattered around the living room, his slippers beside his bed, everything became a frozen memory in a time that would never return in the same way. What he didn't know was that, more than a geographic change, he was about to experience a shift in identity. That transformation that's invisible to the outside world, but that forever alters the way someone perceives themselves. The battlefield was still far away, but inside, something was already beginning to break. The anxiety of not knowing if I would return. The tension of moving away from everything that gave meaning to my existence. It's like standing on a bridge that crumbles with every step, and yet you keep walking, because going back is no longer an option. At this stage, the pain still has no name, just a constant weight in the chest as if something were about to happen, but no one can say what. This is where many people get lost, because it's easy to look at someone who's been to war and imagine the trauma begins with the first shot. But the hidden truth is that it begins at the moment of departure, in the mother's eyes trying to hide her tears, in the son who doesn't understand why his father has to go, in the wife who, even smiling, has a broken soul inside. It's in this silence full of love and fear that the first invisible scar is born, and this has an impact few understand, because those who leave carry the responsibility of returning whole. But what does it mean to return whole when parts of you are scattered in memories, promises, and unresolved goodbyes? He hadn't yet seen a gun, hadn't yet boarded a helicopter, hadn't yet faced a mission, but he was no longer the same man who woke up early and drank coffee in that same kitchen as before. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what came after that match was far beyond anything he could have imagined, and what happened behind the scenes in his mind during the first days of combat reveals a truth that few people have the courage to face. Comment here. That makes sense to me. You never forget the sound of the first gunshot. No matter how much training you've done, how many times you've mentally prepared, how many videos you've watched, or how many stories you've heard from veterans, nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the real feeling of that moment when chaos ceases to be theory and becomes a smell, a texture, and an echo. It's as if the entire world shrinks in a single second, and everything you knew about yourself is ripped away, without warning, without anesthesia. The ground vibrates. The air seems denser. Your heart races so fast you wonder if it can handle it. And even though your body is there, poised, steady, thoughts scatter like shards of glass inside your head. You hear the screams, the warnings, the rushing, and at the same time, a strange silence sets in, as if your brain has activated a survival mode that dissociates you from reality itself. Everything is movement and confusion, and yet, you feel frozen in time, trapped between what was and what has just begun. The smell of dust mixed with gunpowder, the metallic clang of the guns, the vibration in my chest with each distant explosion, it's all much more physical than I imagined. It's not like a movie, where there's a soundtrack, dramatic cuts, and time to understand what's happening. There's no pause. It's all simultaneous, raw, unfiltered, and the first thing he thought of, amidst this whirlwind, wasn't strategy or mission. It was his son, his face, that last time you hugged him at the gate. It's curious how even in hell some memories insist on surfacing with an almost cruel clarity, and it was at that moment that something truly broke, because until then, there had been a certain distance between him and the war, a mental space where he could still pretend everything was temporary, that all he had to do was endure for a while, that all he had to do was fulfill his role, and everything would return to normal. But it didn't, because after the first shot nothing seemed familiar anymore. The very notion of time fragmented. Hours felt like days. Days turned into weeks, and his body continued to move automatically, but his mind was slowly disintegrating. The fear was constant. But it wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the fear of going mad, of losing control, of no longer being who I was. It was the fear that, even if I survived physically, something inside me would never return. Each mission came with a new dose of tension, a weight that accumulated in places in my body that not even the uniform could hide. The stiffness in my jaw, the tension in my shoulders, the locked muscles. It was as if my body itself was screaming for help, even when my mouth was telling me everything was fine. And then came the losses. Platoon mates who, one day, were there sharing a piece of bread, laughing at a silly joke, and the next were just a name, an absence. Each death left a mark, not only because of the pain of loss, but because of the silent guilt that began to grow. That question no one says out loud, but everyone carries. Why him and not me? This kind of thinking slowly eats away. And when you least expect it, you're waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, reliving it all over again as if trapped in an endless cycle. This is where the most dangerous transformation begins, that of his gaze. His gaze was no longer the same. Previously lively and attentive, it was now distant, like someone always on alert but emotionally absent. His eyes said more than words. They were the eyes of someone who has seen too much. And this change is subtle at first. His colleagues notice, but no one speaks, because everyone is experiencing the same kind of internal deterioration, and silence becomes an unspoken rule. It's easier not to speak. It's easier to follow. But inside, the weight grows. The mind tries to process everything, but defense mechanisms begin to fail. Decisions that once seemed simple now felt like a chill down the spine. The sound of a simple door slamming made the body react as if under attack. The tension never left. It was like living on a tightrope, waiting for the moment it would snap. And yet he tried to maintain his composure, to be the strong soldier, the one who endures, the one who doesn't break. But there were times, especially in the long, silent early mornings, when he found himself staring at the tent ceiling, trying to remember the sound of his son's laughter, or the smell of his wife's coffee on Sunday mornings. And that hurt more than any visible injury, because what he was losing wasn't just peace. It was the connection to what gave life meaning. This disconnection grew deeper. Days became about survival. The small joys disappeared. And all that was left was to fulfill the role, one step at a time. A war mentality that allowed no room for vulnerability. The hidden truth was that, to stay in the field, you had to shut down parts of yourself. You had to toughen up. But the problem is, when you return home, those parts don't reconnect on their own. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding what happens when the war ends, but the internal battle continues, is what reveals the true extent of the invisible scars. Write in the comments, I'm on that journey too. He smiled, but he was in pieces. On the outside, his uniform was now stored away. His body no longer carried weapons. The sounds of war were behind him. But on the inside, nothing was resolved. In fact, it was as if the war had simply changed scenery, moved from the battlefield to settle silently and cruelly inside his mind. A war without sirens, without gunfire, but with many more traps. Because this was a war no one saw. The first few days back were the strangest. It was as if he'd returned to a world that was moving forward while he was frozen in another reality. People talked about bills, new TV shows, vacation plans, and he didn't know how to participate in the conversation anymore. He felt out of place, like someone trying to dance to a music they no longer feel. The smells, the sounds, the city lights, everything seemed too loud, too fast, too intense, and at the same time, empty. He was present, yet emotionally absent, as if his body were there, but his soul was still on the other side of the world. At night, it was worse, because during the day at least there was movement. There were voices, appointments, distractions, but when everything fell silent, when the house grew dark and the clock ticked toward dawn, then the ghost returned. Sleep wouldn't come, and when it did, it was interrupted by nightmares so real that he'd wake up drenched, his heart racing, his muscles tense, as if he'd just run for his life. Sometimes he'd wake feeling like he was on the floor, searching for the gun that was no longer there. Other times he'd just sit in bed silently, trying to remember where he was, as if his mind was slow to accept that it was all over, but he hadn't. And that was the truth that hurt the most. The war still lived within him, and no one understood that. People said, I'm glad you came back in one piece. Now it's time to start over. You're a hero. Beautiful, well-intentioned words, but in practice, they only reinforced the silence. Because how can you explain that you don't feel whole? How can you say that sometimes you feel like you've lost the ability to feel? How can you say that that smile at family lunch was just an effort not to worry anyone? Guilt was a constant shadow, not only for the mistakes made, because war, however orderly and mission-driven, involves decisions no one should have to make, but also for survival, for having returned when so many stayed, for the mother who mourned her son's absence, for the companion who gave his life to save others, for the child he couldn't protect in time. These memories returned as fragments, unexpectedly, like flashes that punctuated everyday life and shattered any sense of peace. And that's when he began to feel broken inside. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger, it was emptiness, a kind of emotional numbness that made everything seem distant, as if he were just watching life unfold from afar, unable to participate. Connecting with his wife became more difficult, with his son even more so. How can you explain to an 8-year-old boy why his father can't play, why he avoids hugs, why he gets scared at every noise? How can you tell him that this strong father now needs to summon the courage just to get out of bed? And the most painful thing is that no one saw it, because on the surface, he continued functioning. He went to the market, exchanged messages, said good morning to his neighbors. But each gesture was like a piece fitted together by obligation. Nothing came naturally. The hidden truth is that at many moments, he would rather return to the battlefield than deal with the silence within himself, because there, at least, everything made sense. There was a mission, there was structure, there was camaraderie. Here, there was just a man trying to remember who he was before all of this. The inner workings of someone who returns from war are confusing, contradictory, and often dark, and society isn't prepared to deal with this kind of pain. It wants results. It wants overcoming, the beautiful speech, the inspiring story. But there's not always a catchphrase. Sometimes there's just a man lying on the couch, silent, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why his heart still weighs so heavily, why sleep won't come, why fear still resides there, even when nothing threatening is in sight. That's why so many people who return from war end up losing themselves, because there's no manual, there's no off button. The mind doesn't understand that the war is over just because the plane landed. It takes time, it takes courage, and it takes truth. The courage to look within and acknowledge, I'm not okay, and it's okay not to be okay. This is the beginning of transformation. When we stop feigning strength and start seeking healing, when the armor begins to crack and amidst the shrapnel, the possibility of reconstruction emerges. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a point where many give up, but also where the first signs of hope begin to emerge, and it is at this point that the journey truly changes direction. Comment here, that makes sense to me. You came back, so you should be fine, but you weren't. That was the phrase that echoed even when no one said it out loud. It was the look on his face as he shook his hand and said, "It's good to see you back." It was his old schoolmate saying, "Imagine the experience you've had." It was even his wife's relieved expression trying to smile, even though she didn't quite understand who she'd married now. Everyone seemed to believe the worst was over, that the plane touching down was a sign of a new beginning. But deep down he knew he was still there, not in that physical place, but in a mental state that couldn't be explained with ordinary words. The attempt to get his life back on track was constant, and even seemed to work on the outside. He went back to driving, shopping, sitting on the couch with his son and feigning interest in a cartoon. He laughed when someone made a joke at the Sunday barbecue. He paid bills, cleaned the car, even played with the dog for a few minutes. But there was something inside him that screamed silently, a kind of muffled but present pain, as if each of these activities were a hastily staged play, just to make the world believe everything was okay. But it wasn't. And this dissonance between appearance and reality became a heavy burden to bear. The silence hurt more than any memory, because he didn't know how to put into words what he didn't even fully understand. How could he explain that the sound of the door slamming made his chest tighten, that sometimes he simply sat in the bathroom with the shower running for long minutes, doing nothing, just trying to regain consciousness? How could he say that his mind still mapped out exits, possible threats, suspicious noises, even within his own home? It was as if his internal system hadn't understood that it could now turn off the alarm. And so, his body functioned, but his soul didn't. This kind of suffering is treacherous because it doesn't bleed. It doesn't break bones, it doesn't leave visible marks. On the contrary, he wears clean clothes, responds politely, makes jokes in the elevator, and this fools everyone, even those who feel it. He began to believe that maybe this was how it was, that this was the new normal, that his old self had died somewhere in the war, and what remained was just a functional but empty fragment, a presence that filled spaces but didn't truly live. This mindset is dangerous because it prevents people from asking for help, and the world doesn't always help those who don't cry out. He realized that the better he appeared, the less people asked how he really felt. The world applauded his strength, unaware that it was precisely this armor that prevented him from healing. Because to heal, you must first accept that there are wounds, and he didn't feel allowed to do that. The war may have ended, but there was a much bigger battle going on inside him, to accept his vulnerability as part of healing, not as weakness. It was at this point that he began to lose himself. Not scandalously, not with public meltdowns or explosive outbursts, but in small gestures. He began to withdraw, sleeping more on the couch, leaving the house aimlessly, avoiding eye contact, responding with monosyllables, forgetting his nephew's birthday. And little by little he began to erase parts of himself, like someone turning off light bulbs one by one in a house until everything went dark. His family noticed, but no one knew what to do. Friends distanced themselves, believing it was just a phase, and deep down he felt that perhaps that was the price of coming back. The hidden truth behind this silence is that he was trying to save himself in solitude. He tried reading self-help texts, watching motivational videos, making mental gratitude lists, but nothing really worked, because the problem wasn't a lack of effort, it was the weight of a pain he'd never learned to name. And while this went unacknowledged, the emptiness only grew. He began to believe he was the problem, that everyone else seemed to be able to return to normal, except him. And this constant comparison with the other soldiers who overcame became yet another burden, yet another guilt to carry. But there were moments, however brief, when something inside him whispered, like a ray of hope, a tiny spark that said, "You don't have to pretend forever." It was in those moments, usually in the wee hours of the morning, alone in the living room, staring into space, that he felt a deep desire to be real, to take off his armor, to say quietly even to himself, "I'm not okay, I can't sleep, I need help." And perhaps that was the first step, because there is no transformation without recognition, there is no healing without truth, and above all, there is no reconstruction while you are trapped in the obligation to appear whole. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is an emotional rupture that changes everything, and when it happens, it's as if a breach opens up, and for the first time, something new begins to enter. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point in your journey when everything inside you starts to crumble, but on the outside, no one notices. And perhaps that's what hurts the most, screaming for help in the silence while the world keeps spinning as if nothing were wrong. It's at this point that the pain stops being just pain and transforms into a kind of existential weariness, a weight that builds with every breath. You get up, walk, work, smile, but you feel yourself slowly disappearing, as if you're sinking on your feet. The nights became the cruelest scenario. When the world outside fell silent, everything inside me grew louder. My thoughts ran wild, unchecked, bringing back scenes, voices, faces. I tossed and turned in bed, searching for a position that would silence them, but there was no position that brought peace. Sleep came in fragments. My heart raced for no reason. Sometimes I felt like I was falling from a high place, even lying down, and other times, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn to feign normalcy once more. It was during those late nights that I realized how much the mind can become a prison. Anxiety was like an alarm that wouldn't turn off, a constant warning that something was about to go wrong, even when everything seemed calm. It was the fear of the unexpected, of loss, of failure, but most of all the fear of myself, where these thoughts could lead me. I began to isolate myself more. I declined invitations, avoided talking too much. The smallest gesture, the smallest demand seemed too much for me. Messages piled up on my phone. The missed calls became further proof that I was distancing myself from everything, including myself. And then came the darkest point, the one where you no longer feel anger, sadness, or fear, just emptiness. A void so deep, it seems endless. I'd find myself looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing who was there. There was no longer any sparkle in my eyes, no purpose in my actions. It was as if I were living out of obligation. And the hidden truth is that at that point, everything starts to lose its meaning. Eating, showering, leaving the house. It all seems like too much effort for someone who just wanted a break from themselves. I remember exactly the day I sat on the bedroom floor, the light off, my head down, and thought, maybe no one will miss me if I stop. That phrase came as a whisper, but it chilled me to the bone, because it was at that moment that I realized how far I was on the edge. It wasn't drama, it wasn't exaggeration. It was the result of everything I had swallowed for so long, and it was there, at the bottom of the well, that my soul collapsed silently. No one saw, no one knew, but I completely fell apart. The cruelest part of all this is that, on the outside, I remained functional. I did my tasks. I answered the basics. Sometimes I even made jokes, and this confused people. You're fine, they'd say. You look strong. But the truth is, there are pains that specialize in hiding, and the more you learn to disguise them, the further away you become from help. The mind gets used to surviving on autopilot, and the soul, suffocated, learns to keep quiet. It was at this point in my journey that I realized one of the greatest revelations. No one notices when you're falling apart inside. Silent pain is lonely, and only those who have been there know how real it is. That's why when someone tells me, it doesn't seem like you've been through that, I just smile, because surviving with invisible scars requires a strength no one teaches, and it requires an internal, silent decision to keep going, even without understanding why. This rock bottom didn't come with a warning sign. It built slowly, with layers of small withdrawals, giving up on talking, on asking for help, on trying, and before I knew it, I was no longer trying to live. I was just avoiding death. This is the kind of thing many people will silently relate to, because there are thousands who live like this, existing on emotional autopilot, unsure of how to escape. But even there, even on that cold bedroom floor, there was a spark that refused to go out. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and perhaps that's what true hope is made of. A breath, even in the midst of chaos, a memory, a song, a forgotten verse, an inner voice that says, it's not over yet. That spark didn't save me immediately, but it kept me there, and sometimes that alone is a victory. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you understand what it's like to fall apart inside without anyone noticing. He didn't know exactly what to expect. Sitting in the waiting room with the clock ticking away louder than it should have been, everything in him screamed to leave. His hands were sweating, his chest tight. His dry throat insisted on keeping the words from coming out naturally. What if this was just another waste of time? What if no one truly understood what was going on inside? What if opening this door meant revisiting everything he'd fought so hard to bury? But something, perhaps that memory of his son, or the silent gaze of his wife who no longer knew what to do, kept him there. The therapist greeted him with a serene smile. She was an ordinary person, seemingly calm, but with a look that didn't treat him like a problem to be solved, but rather as someone who deserved to be heard without judgment. The atmosphere was simple, but welcoming, and for the first half hour he simply remained silent. He considered getting up and saying he couldn't. He considered covering it up with an, "It's okay," but then she said, with a surprising lightness, "You don't need to know where to start. We just need to be here." And that, however small it seemed, opened a crack, like a crack in a very old wall. He spoke little that first time, a few loose sentences, a line here and there without depth. But when he left, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference. Something had moved. Maybe it was just the feeling of not being pressured, maybe the relief of having gotten through that moment without running away, or maybe it was the beginning of something he didn't even understand yet. Because for the first time he felt that perhaps he wasn't alone on this internal journey, and that feeling, however fragile, was enough to keep him coming back the following week. Over time the words began to come, sometimes with anger, sometimes with pain, sometimes with silence between sentences, but they began, and each time he returned to that room, he left some of the weight behind. Not that he was healing completely. He knew scars like those don't disappear with the snap of a finger, but there was room to look at them without hiding. For the first time, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to smile if he didn't want to. There, he could just be himself. And that, after all, was a kind of miracle. The curious thing is that, at the same time he allowed himself to speak, he also began to listen, listening to himself, noticing the thoughts that previously passed too quickly, noting the emotions he'd avoided, seeing memories with new eyes, no longer as threats but as parts of a story he was learning to reorganize. And the more he accessed these inner layers, the more the rigidity began to give way to a new vulnerability, which wasn't weakness, it was humanity. It was in this process that faith reappeared, and not as a rigid religious notion, but as a subtle presence he hadn't felt in years. Perhaps because way back then he'd mistaken faith for blind force, or perhaps because he thought God didn't dwell in the rubble of a ruined mind. But there was one night, after a particularly difficult session, when he sat on the porch, alone, and simply looked up at the sky. It was cloudy, starless, but still he whispered something. It wasn't a full prayer, it was just a timid request. Help me. And in that request there was more truth than in all the beautiful words he'd tried to say in the past few months. That didn't solve everything. It didn't bring immediate answers. But it was like lighting a candle in a dark room. The light was small, but enough to keep him from feeling lost. Faith in that moment wasn't the certainty that everything would be okay. It was the hope that, even in the midst of chaos, there was a way. And that changed everything. It changed the way he saw his pain. It changed the way he looked at his son. It even changed the way he breathed when he woke up. He began to realize that starting over didn't require perfection. It required determination. And he still had that. Therapy gave him structure. Faith gave him meaning. And together, these two pillars began to support what he previously thought impossible, the beginning of a new identity. No longer the wounded soldier trying to hide the shrapnel, but the man rebuilding himself who slowly understood that his scars were not signs of weakness but of survival, and that perhaps by sharing this pain with those willing to listen, he could not only heal, but also be a bridge for others who carry similar silences. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a point in the journey where the pain does not disappear, but gives way to the most unexpected strength, and it is in this territory that the true miracle begins to take shape. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. Starting over is a beautiful word when written in books or spoken by someone watching from the outside. But in the flesh, in the depths of one's being, starting over is a daily battle. He discovered this in the most real way possible. After the first therapy session, after that sigh of hope on the porch, came days when everything seemed to be moving forward, days when he truly believed things could change. And in part, they were changing. But no one warns him that transformation doesn't follow a straight line. It's not a constant climb. It's full of curves, falls, and twists. And he realized this when, out of nowhere, he again experienced that crisis he thought he'd overcome. It was an ordinary morning, as he was making coffee. The smell was the same as always, the light streaming through the window with that softness he loved so much, and yet his body froze. An invisible trigger, perhaps some memory he couldn't even identify, activated something inside him. His heart raced, his hands began to tremble, and a wave of anguish washed over him as if something terrible were about to happen. But there was no danger, just him, the coffee maker, and a silent kitchen. It was like going back in time, as if everything he had achieved in the past few months had evaporated, and it hurt. The hidden truth is that no one talks much about the behind the scenes of healing, about the days when it feels like everything's back to square one, and he felt it intensely. That day was hard, not because it was the worst, but because it was unexpected. It was a kind of internal betrayal, and for a few hours he almost believed all his effort had been in vain, that the therapy, the faith, the conversations, the notebooks filled with notes, the late nights thinking about meaning and purpose, none of it had worked. But it wasn't true. It was just real life, the real journey. Because starting over isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to live with it. And this took time to become clear. With each step forward, he began to understand that the goal was never to forget. The goal was to reorganize, to create space within himself so that the past would no longer occupy everything all the time, so that the present could have a voice, so that his eyes could once again see what was around him, and not just the memories that came like storms. He learned that healing doesn't mean it won't hurt from time to time. It just means the wound no longer bleeds as it used to, that now there's a little more strength between the cracks. Still, the days weren't easy. The urge to give up appeared disguised as fatigue, as, I'm not going to the session today, as, I'll talk to her later, as, it's okay, it's just a phase. But he began to recognize these disguises. He began to observe his own patterns, and little by little, he began to develop a new mindset, one that was kinder to himself. He began to accept that starting over requires small, consistent decisions, that the impact isn't just in grand gestures, but in the simple act of waking up and trying again, even when everything seems to be trying to pull him down. In this process, revelations emerged. He understood, for example, that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone, that the pain he felt was legitimate, even if no one saw it, that his journey was unique, and that there was no one-size-fits-all healing model. This brought freedom, and along with it, responsibility, because by accepting his pain, he also needed to accept that change depended on him, not on magic formulas, not on catchphrases, but on real choices. Choices like continuing to go to therapy, even when he didn't feel like it. Choices like writing what I felt, even when the words seemed to tear the paper. Choices like stopping running away from my own story. He realized that each setback brought with it a chance to delve deeper, that fears were signs of where he still needed to look, that doubts weren't failures but part of the journey, and most importantly, that the internal struggle was constant proof that he was still there, resisting, growing, rebuilding, because there is no new beginning without discomfort, and there is no healing without confrontation. And the more he faced this head-on, the more he saw the truth about himself. He wasn't weak, never had been. He just didn't know how to deal with everything he felt, and now he was learning. This learning wasn't just about the trauma, it was about life, about how to live more consciously, about how to be a father, a husband, a man, not based on external expectations, but on who he truly wanted to be. And this changed his relationships. He began to open up more to his wife, to listen more, to make mistakes and apologize without feeling inferior. He began to look at his son with softer eyes, recognizing that, even without understanding, that child was the first ray of light that kept him from losing himself completely. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is a precious moment in this journey where chaos begins to give way to presence, and it is precisely in this space that the silent miracle begins to be born. Comment here. That makes sense to me. It was an ordinary night. Nothing spectacular had happened that day. No big conversations, no shocking revelations, no visible breakthroughs. It was just another day among many. He had dinner with his family, helped his son with his homework, and watched a bit of a random movie before going to bed. But there was something different that night, something so subtle that he only noticed it when he was already in the dark room, lying down with his eyes closed. For the first time in a long time, there was no tension in his body, no intrusive thoughts, no distorted images of memories that insisted on returning when the world fell silent. Just a calm emptiness, a space where fear didn't take hold. He turned onto his side, pulled the sheet up to his shoulder, and instead of the familiar tightness in his chest, he felt his body relax. It wasn't an effort. It wasn't the result of some technique. It was natural, organic, almost imperceptible. And precisely for that reason it was so powerful, because in that moment he wasn't fighting anything. He wasn't trying to overcome insomnia with distractions or control his thoughts with mental discipline. He was simply present, breathing slowly, with his heart at peace, and then he fell asleep. Without realizing it, without the shock that woke him with a tense body, without his eyes wide open trying to understand where he was, he simply slept. A simple, continuous, complete sleep. And this, for someone who spent years fighting silent battles every time the sun set, was more than a breakthrough. It was a miracle, because the true miracle didn't arrive with a spectacle. There were no lights in the sky or visible signs. It arrived with silence, with an absence of fear, with rest. That night, he understood what a miracle was. Not a religious miracle in the traditional sense, but a miracle of the soul. The miracle of no longer being at war with one's body, of no longer needing to hide one's thoughts out of shame, of no longer carrying guilt in one's heart before closing one's eyes. The miracle of being able to simply exist, without defending oneself against everything, without needing to justify one's own pain. It was that night that he realized how much he had been fighting not only against the past, but also against the very possibility of peace. And now, it had arrived, without warning, without imposition. It simply arrived. And when he woke, what surprised him most wasn't that he'd slept. It was what he felt when he opened his eyes. There was no rush, no confusion. There was just a pleasant silence, a new emptiness, not the oppressive emptiness of before, but a free space, as if within him there was now room to breathe. to begin again with lightness, and that transformed everything. That morning, he prepared his coffee more carefully. He smelled the bread toasting. He looked out the window and noticed the leaves swaying in the wind. Small details, but they took on meaning again, because now, he was no longer stuck on the autopilot of survival. He was present, and presence, for someone who spent so long hiding from his own mind, is an incalculable gift. And that didn't mean everything was resolved. He knew that. There would be other difficult days, other nights where sleep might be hard to come by. But on that particular night, something broke. Something was freed. And even though he couldn't explain it, he felt it. Something inside him had changed definitively. Maybe it was the beginning of a new relationship with his own history. Maybe it was the acceptance that he didn't need to erase anything to build something new. Maybe it was just the relief of knowing that peace was, indeed, possible. This kind of miracle, silent and profound, isn't shouted from the rooftops. It's felt, experienced, and kept as a sacred secret. It's like a seed planted in the dark, sprouting quietly but growing with a power no one could have imagined. That's when he understood. Not every new beginning comes with clarity. Sometimes it's born in the middle of the night, and when the soul rests, even for a few hours, it's as if everything inside the body understands that there is life after pain. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the real challenge is not just finding peace, but learning to care for it, protect it, and build a new meaning for living from that place. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you carry invisible scars, know that they don't have to define you. For a long time, he believed his worth was compromised, that after everything he'd lived, seen, and felt, he would never be whole again. But the truth that only reveals itself after much silent struggle, is that scars aren't the end. They're records, marks of survival. They're pieces of a story that continues to be written, even when everything seems frozen. And it was precisely when he stopped running from these scars and began to accept them as part of his path, that the true healing process began to blossom. The pain that seemed immutable began to lighten, not because it disappeared, but because he stopped feeding it with fear and shame. He began to name what he felt, to listen to himself more gently, to recognize his limits, and most importantly, to realize that there were other people going through the same internal battles, even if they all wore different masks. This revelation brought an unexpected connection with the world. Where there had been isolation, now empathy emerged. Where there had been self-judgment, now understanding emerged. This is the most beautiful part of the journey. When suffering stops being just a burden and becomes a bridge, when what once paralyzed you begins, little by little, to bring you closer to others. He discovered that he didn't need to hide to be accepted, that he didn't need to constantly appear strong to be loved, and that there was no longer any reason to remain silent, because the silence that protected him was also what imprisoned him. By putting his pain into words, he not only freed himself but also lit a light on the path for those still trying to escape the darkness. All of this came gradually, respecting his inner timing. No transformation happens in a hurry. The process was made up of small, daily decisions. Waking up, taking a deep breath, showing up, speaking even when afraid, trusting even when there was no guarantee. And in doing so, he created new structures within himself. A new mindset, more open to vulnerability, closer to compassion, more honest with his own humanity. And this mindset was the foundation for something much greater than he imagined. A new beginning. Starting over, he realized, isn't about going back to who he was. It's about allowing yourself to be who you're becoming. It's about looking in the mirror and accepting that the image reflected carries struggles, but also courage, that behind every weary gaze lies someone who didn't give up. And that, in itself, is an act of greatness. Because in a world that values appearance and performance, choosing to feel, to face, to grow, it's a kind of silent revolution that few have the courage to experience. But those who do, transform not only their own story, but also the space around them. That's why, in recounting this journey, he wasn't seeking applause or pity. He was seeking truth. Sharing this journey was a way of reaffirming, it is possible. It is possible to fall and get up. It is possible to lose yourself and find meaning again. It is possible to have bad days and still keep going. It is possible to look within and, amidst the chaos, find something sacred, something that has withstood everything. And that something is you. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there comes a time when pain begins to be returned to the world not as a wound, but as a testimony. And when this happens, something powerful awakens within us. A silent mission of collective healing, where each voice raised helps another not to be silent. Comment here. I'm on that journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something along this path resonated with you. And perhaps, like him, you're also in the midst of a fresh start, trying to organize from within everything that no one sees from the outside. That's why this channel exists, so we can walk together unhurriedly without masks, only with truth. If this content touched something deep inside you, if it kept you company at a time when you needed to hear something different, subscribe to the channel, because there's still so much to be said, and each new story is a space for breathing, reflection, and shared courage. And if you want to show me that you stayed until the end, leave it in the comments. I'm with you until the end. I'll know you felt this conversation the way it was intended, soul to soul. Oh, and leave a like too, not just as a gesture, but as an acknowledgement that this exchange was valuable. That's what keeps this space alive and meaningful to more people. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.